good afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. I'm Dania Dhafar. I'm the Executive Director at Gulf International Forum. It's a pleasure to welcome you all. I'm delighted to introduce our event today, Feminist Perspectives in the Gulf, Navigating Intersectionality. I will first introduce our moderator, Zarqa Parvaz. She's a researcher, writer, and a PhD candidate at Durham University. And her research focuses on national identity, women's state and society in the Gulf region. And she's was also a former lecturer in Middle Eastern Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. I'm also very pleased to welcome our other panelists. We have a stellar lineup of speakers today, but I'll go ahead and pass it over to Zarqa, who will be introducing everyone. She's playing a dual role. She'll be speaking and also moderating. Thank you so much, Zarqa.
Thank you, Dania, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to you and to Gulf International Forum for organizing such an important discussion at such a crucial time. Feminist perspectives from the Gulf, navigating intersectionality, a topic that I am personally very interested in. Thank you to everyone who's joining us. It is my honor and pleasure to be moderating today's session and to be hearing from our brilliant speakers. Now, please allow me to frame today's discussion before I introduce the speakers to you. So feminism has become one of the most famous terms and a hotly debated concept in the Gulf in the past few years. And it's kind of created, I would say, two camps. So aside that advocates for feminism claims to use this ideology or this concept to emphasize political, economic, and social rights of the women in the region, and those who oppose the ideology claim that it is imported from the West without the contextual underpinnings of the realities in the Gulf. In today's discussion, I would like to start by deconstructing some of the concepts relating to the term feminism. And before we go and talk about intersectional feminism, I'm going to start by posing questions and to hear from our speakers and from our audience. I'm hoping for this to be a very engaging session. So before we talk about intersectional feminism, I know Dr. Haneen is going to talk about this in detail. I want to just talk a little bit about feminism in the Gulf and the questions around it. So what is feminism? Part of the problem surrounding the discussions on feminism is that it is viewed as a homogeneous category, as a monolithic term. But feminism, and I think everybody today would agree, is not just a theory or belief system or an ideology. It's many different things from many different people. It could be an idea that women are humans. It could be a political project or an academic and intellectual framework that a mode of analysis, a way of asking questions and looking for answers. But if we look at feminism, at its core, as something that talks about gender equality and promoting women's rights as human beings, then how do we, for this ideology then to manifest into, let's say, a movement or an organized ideology, women would have to unite on the basis of being women. But women is not one category. A woman is an inherently diverse group. So how do we unite? And that is one of the core questions of feminism, the question of solidarity. This notion of diversity is what intersectional feminism talks about, a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Not going to go into details, but I just want to acknowledge that intersectional feminism at its very core is the acknowledgement that a woman does not just suffer because of her gender, but her suffering or her discrimination is influenced by the context within which she exists and her multiple identities, including race, ethnicity, religion, etc. Intersectional feminism, and this is important for me at least, has two strands, one that focuses on identities, and I think we have to be careful here, especially in the context of Gulf, not to use identities as essentialized categories, and the other focuses on structures, so how people are placed within structures. And I think this is important, using intersectional feminism as a framework of understanding domination and oppression, and how they overlap in different societies. And now the other part of our discussion in the Gulf, before we talk about, let's say, reforms, whether top-down or bottom-up, I think we have to look at the ideology and the vision behind these reforms, and the systems and structures that further perpetuate discrimination against various groups before we even talk about women. I think we have to reconsider the existing feminist discourses in the region, and we have to ask how inclusive or exclusive they are. Are we really talking about intersectionality? I know the conversation has started, but what do we mean when we say intersectionality in the Gulf? Are we just perpetuating certain categories such as migrant, bidun, tribal, domestic worker, etc.? And I think this is where intellectual discussions with broader groups within the society comes in, such as the one today. I think intersectional feminism is relevant in the Gulf, and we're about to find out how. But I think we also have to be careful about how we define groups, such as ethnic groups, social groups within the Gulf, because they are defined very differently from the West. So how much have we already worked on defining these categories? I want to start by posing some general questions that I hope all the speakers would speak to in the discussion. In the context of intersectional feminism in the Gulf, which identities, and here I say identities as a construct, not as a given, are prevalent in the Gulf, and which ones are more privileged than the other? So for example, what does race, economic, social class, national identity, religious identity means in the Gulf? What groups of women are structurally and systematically privileged over others, and which structures discriminate certain group of people over others? And lastly, are we having enough discussions with different groups of women? Are we speaking on their behalf, or are they speaking for themselves? Have we given them enough protection? Which groups are invisible to the discussion on women's rights, and which is being underrepresented? My last point before I introduce our brilliant speakers is that it's not just a question of who you are, but who you are within the structures. And only then can we start to problematize structures and move beyond this idea of women's rights as a blanket term. Please allow me to introduce some of brilliant colleagues and panelists. Dr. Al-Ghabra, who is an assistant professor at Kuwait University and the author of the book Muslim Women and White Femininity, as well as Reenactment and Resistance. Her areas of interest include exploring hegemonic and racist narratives via text, images, and bodies. Dr. Muna Karim, who is the author of 3 poetry collections. She is a 2021 NEA grant fellow. Her most recent publication, Femme Ghosts, is a trilingual chap book published by Publication Studio in 2019. Hasna Mukhtar, who is a writer and Fulbright alumna and a PhD candidate at Clark University. Her dissertation focuses on decolonizing knowledge production of gender-based violence in the Arab Gulf. Sheikh Al-Hashim, who is a writer and a researcher from Kuwait, focusing on women, migrant workers, and political economy. Sheikh is also a PhD candidate at the European Graduate School in the Philosophy, Art, and Critical Theory program with a focus on gender. Sana Qadri, who is a second-generation Indian immigrant born and raised in Dubai. She is a recent graduate of Gulf Studies from University of Exeter in the UK and is a writer and a multimedia journalist. Currently, she hosts the podcast, hosts and produces the podcast on Cafe Khalij, where she platforms upcoming researchers and academics from the Gulf region. I would like to now invite our first speaker, Dr. Haneen, to introduce to us intersectional feminism and how it's observed in the Gulf. Dr. Haneen, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Dr. Hani. We can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
I was really into it too. And then, okay. So thank you for that beautiful and extensive introduction. What I want to say is we can't really go into intersectional feminism until we go back in time briefly to contextualize how we got here, how we got to intersectionality in the first place. So I'm going to use the US as an example, because mainstream feminism came out of there, and it has been controlled by the media. And so that's all that we see. And so there were four movements, let's say four waves, even though I'm not sure if I believe in this fourth wave, but we can speak about that later. There was the first movement, right, where in the US they wanted the right to vote. It ended in 1920. Then there was a second movement. This second movement, I believe, and a lot of other theorists believe, that this was the foundation for what would later become intersectional feminism for a number of reasons. First, the second movement and the first movement were led by white women, and it was sparked by the civil rights movement. So white women especially were seeing Black men and women, but it was mostly men, asking for their civil rights, wanting more equality in the workforce to white men. And so this movement developed where women wanted especially more abortion rights. Okay, so there was also domestic violence and rape. But what was so selfish about this movement and privilege, if we want to speak about privilege, like Zarqa was saying, is that it was sparked by the Black struggle to gain equal rights, but they left the women of color behind because they had other integral rights, economic needs, reproductive rights, jobs, better housing, other needs other than, let's say, abortion. And so here there was a split. This is where the problem began. There was also a split with men, which is really important to acknowledge, because the problem is not with men, by the way, it's with the system of patriarchy. And so the media portrayed the movements as if they were against men. There were a small group of women that didn't want men in the movement, but it was very small. And this is really important because portraying feminism as anti-male is very hurtful for the movement. This sustains male dominance. We actually need men in the movement. And so this is in a general sense. Now, so in 1989, we have this movement where we said there was a split between different women, and Kimberly Crenshaw comes in 1989, and she coins the term intersectionality. She was a lawyer and she was a civil rights activist, and she said we need to look at the interlocking nature of the identities of women, and we can't just look at gender, but we need to look at other intersections such as race, class, all the different isms. So, for example, a woman, it can't just be women being equal to men. That's the basis of white feminism. A Black woman is going to have a different experience than a white woman. So so basically the definition of intersectionality or intersectional feminism is it asks us to consider how all of our identities come together to shape our lived experiences within structures of power. So in this third movement that happened in the 90s, women of color, queer women, all different types of women were like, you cannot equate just gender. We have different needs. A Black woman has different needs than a disabled white woman, than a Latina woman, than an Arab woman from a lower class income, education, even beauty, etc. And so when you look at theorists, intersectional theorists like Alcoff, Anzaldúa, Calafel, Patricia Hill Collins, Crenshaw, Mohanty, who's a transnational intersectional feminist, they're claiming that experiences of women of color are the products of interlocking patterns of racism, classism, sexism. So when we're moving in a feminist movement, let's say, we need to look at the intersections of our identities. We can't look at identities as standalone categories, and that's really important. And this is just to make it simple. Now, a lot of people say that there was a fourth movement, that the internet was, it came in and it shifted. We started to have this call-out culture and speak about sexism and misogyny and harassment. Now, the problem is when we equate it to Kuwait, or the Arab world in general, is we all we saw was the mainstream feminism, which was literally the second feminist movement. It's always highlighted in the media. And we started to borrow from the second movement because we're stuck. We're actually in the second movement. We have a bunch of laws that are oppressive. Article 153, Article 182. There's certain places where we can't sign for each other as Kuwaiti women. Then there's so many other intersecting oppressions that we're facing in Kuwait. And I don't want to go into this because I know Dr. Muna would speak so much more she's so much more of an expert on this, but we have an issue with Bedouin women, with stateless women in Kuwait, and it's an issue that intersects a bunch of identities, including economic, citizenship, racism, etc. But we have so many other things. We have Islamic feminists, which I'm sure Hassan will talk about, which are working within the framework, social workers, domestic workers. So we have all these different women who have different needs under this huge system of patriarchal, capitalistic neoliberalism. So we have these issues, and I think the struggle for us as intersectional feminists, if we want to frame it from an intersectional feminist lens, is we need to ask ourselves, how can we address the tensions between these opposing needs that women need and feminisms without aiding, imperializing, and colonizing projects? And I think this is a huge challenge for us, and without also aiding local patriarchal projects within the region. This is a tension that I know I and a bunch of other feminists that I know struggle with, because we have to work towards understanding privilege and how it's been normalized into these global systems, but also how here in Kuwait, if you take Kuwait, for example, how are we repeating the same upper class bourgeoisie second and first movement that occurred in the US? We're repeating it exactly when we need to go intersectional. Because if we don't go intersectional, we're only going to help upper class Kuwaiti women, and that's a huge problem. That's not feminism to start with. And so it really a big part of intersectionality is reflexivity. How are you reflecting on your privileges? It's so much easier to say we're oppressed than to say that we're privileged. Hey, I'm Kuwaiti, I'm privileged. So, for example, if you take me, Kuwaiti, who is originally Palestinian, has a PhD, I will have different needs than a woman who is disabled, than a Bedouin woman, than maybe a Kuwaiti woman who is considered asila, right? Or considered original, asila coming from the word pure also, right? Which we could also equate to whiteness. So what are all these interlocking privileges and oppressions coming together? And the last thing I want to say is the problem is not only that we borrowed from the second movement, but we've linked to colonization. If you look at a lot of the feminists, a lot of them are internalizing this colonizing narrative, and we need to step away from this, because this is also going to harm the feminist movement. And so I think I'm going to stop there, if that's okay, and have everyone else speak.
Thank you, Dr. Haneen. I was really enjoying your points, your discussion. I didn't want you to stop. I want to thank you for bringing in colonialism, or the post-colonial lens. I wanted to talk about it, and I was hoping someone would touch about it. And thank you for framing the privilege and power structures within colonial language. So, and also giving us an overview on different types of feminisms that exist within Kuwait. I would now like to move to my next speaker, Dr. Muna Karim, who will be talking to us about abuse and gender-based violence. Dr. Muna, the floor is yours.
صباح الخير, مساء الخير. Thank you for the invitation and for putting this together. I don't know if I'm going to speak about abuse or gender violence. I'm more concerned with feminism as the possibilities of feminism as liberation, right? And I want to thank Dr. Haneen for giving us this preview of intersectionality as it is in its US context, just, especially if there are people who are not familiar with the term. I think now this term has become in circulation, in the past few years in Arabic feminist discussions. I don't know, there's so much to say really and very little time, but I really accepted this invitation because I would like to, I've always been interested in pushing for the consideration of the Bedouin woman experience, the stateless woman who, at least in the Kuwait example, I would say I did my PhD in comparative literature. I studied with Professor Maria Lugones, and I'm familiar with these. Or basically trained in US feminist theory, and when I read Intersectionality, I just felt like there's so much potential out of that for a Bedouin woman. And in articulating that experience, because I've always been committed to feminist struggles, say in Kuwait or in the Arab world in general, but I've never been able to exactly realize why is it that these and like what was wrong with these movements, right? Like I remember going to protest for women, Kuwait's women political rights, suffrage rights in Kuwait. And now I laugh at myself, like, why did I go? These very women are the ones who like gatekeep, and partake in excluding Bedouin women and excluding women of other classes, social classes. So like intersectionality helps you break down this myth of women altogether, like that women are one, or that women are expected to stand in solidarity with each other. I would say I'm worried of like having to compare our, just generally in their world, having to compare our history, feminist history, and like thinking in parallel ways to the US feminist history, because even though we're talking about like marginalized women in US society, there is still this hegemony, which is the hegemony of empire and the West. So I don't think we can always like compare, but I believe that it would be important to be in conversation, right? Like I'm wearing an Audre Lorde sweatshirt, like, so I feel like, yeah, definitely I can relate to these writings, but not necessarily, I do believe that we have to develop our own theory and language, to think about our experiences. So if there is a way to like hijack and reimagine intersectionality, that would be important. So this is why, in 2016, I published a really short text called Manifesto Against the Woman. As you can tell from the title, it's about, against this one definition of woman, but against, this romanticization of the woman as well, right? Like that the Gulf woman is always imagined as a victim, is always imagined as like passive, as not part of this patriarchy. So I wanted to say, like, yeah, no, women can co-create the nation and co-create, this class structure and maintain it and everything. And that was my experience with Kuwaiti women. The feminist movement in Kuwait, and I don't want to say this against individuals or anything, but so far the feminist movement in Kuwait has been state feminism. Feminists in Kuwait have had no issues throwing themselves in the arms of the state. They have been instrumentalized to even delegitimize any political dissent and mass movements for reforms, for change and everything. They have been used in this way, and I think in Gulf countries, I think in third world nations, I think even the fact that we're talking about intersectionality and identity politics and what they have done to public debate in the US. Meanwhile, we have like a vice president in the US, so like we gotta understand that feminism can be dangerous, can be, about accumulation of power and all of that. So when thinking, like when I did the Manifesto Against the Woman, I wanted to say that my experience as a stateless woman is drastically different, right? And that my all the social rights, right? Like, because we got to think about like there is like the personal rights, the social liberation that we seek as women, as individuals. Then there is the liberation that is political, us as part of society and being invested in that. And then there is this parallel thing of like we gotta reimagine feminism altogether. The vast majority of women in the Arab Gulf are immigrant women, yet feminism in the Arab Gulf is absolutely focused on citizen women, absolutely focused on middle class citizen women and what they need and their representative part, because all their discourses have been only about representation, which like brought us nothing really. I don't mean to diminish what has been gained so far, but it's really too small for the ambitions and the needs and concerns on the ground. So I wrote that manifesto, trying to challenge the citizen women experience through the stateless woman experience, and how for the stateless woman, gender oppression is enhanced by that political reality, by that alliances of certain classes with the state, right? Like, and how women play into that by state feminism, by feminism of the upper classes. But last, when I ended my manifesto, I ended it with a poem called Kumari, which is about a domestic worker, and it was inspired by the time when the domestic workers were being accused of murdering children, or being vilified and demonized and deported in masse. So like and I I was saying, like, Kumari, just like, yeah, kill them. If they are if they think of you as a ghost, might as well act as a ghost, and take your power, and this poem resonated with a lot of people, and somehow it really caught this thing of like trying to think this maybe imagine this intersectional, like, feminism from below, right? From like that crushed, invisible, marginalized domestic worker who has no name, who is disposable, to the state, to society, to the women that hire her, and it resonated, even in South Asian countries, where, like, the people felt like, yeah, like, women go to the Gulf and we don't know anything about them, or we don't care, and don't there aren't stories coming back. So I'm saying these, I'm talking about this because I believe, like, all these marginalized figures, like, if we're not gonna imagine and theorize a feminism that comes from the margins and the experiences of such marginalized women, then our project for feminism is, necessarily a failure, right? It's necessarily in service of the state and the current status quo.
Thank you, Dr. Manal, for that very, very intellectually stimulating discussion. There's so much to talk about with what you've said. First of all, reimagining intersectionality, I think, is very important. Coming up with your own language and moving beyond this romanticized view of women in the Gulf. And how can we move beyond state feminism? I think this needs a session on its own. Thank you so much. We move now to Sheikha. Sheikha is going to talk about migrant work, exploitation of migrant workers. Sheikha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Zarqa. Thank you to Gulf International Forum and Dr. Dania and Enes for hosting this very important and extremely timely event. So over the past, 5 to 6 years, the discourse on women's rights, on domestic violence, on eliminating violence against women and girls, sexual harassment more recently, has really taken up space. We see, government entities and corporations today, they mark their calendars to celebrate 16 days of activism and International Women's Day and Mother's Day. We see a horde of like talks and webinars and articles all glorifying, women empowerment. And yet the sheer displacement of the marginalized groups and communities, just like Dr. Muna just said, such as migrant women and specifically migrant domestic workers, from these dialogues, it's so profound and equally unacknowledged. And really, it was the eliminating violence against women that got me to question the absence of a large number of women who are subjected to many and sometimes inconceivable forms of violence. And these forms of violence pass through unchecked, as if violence against domestic workers is their absolute fate. So where and when does our campaigning stop? At what point do we draw the line when we declare publicly to end violence against women? How do we decide who to include and who to exclude? Feminist theory and praxis and movements, especially those that are packaged and disseminated into the mainstream sphere, lack wholeness, as Bell Hooks put it, and so lack broad analysis that could encompass and accommodate a variety of human experiences. So today, as we initiate the conversation on intersectional feminism, it is only the first step towards inviting those voices that have been silenced, that have been excluded, that have been marginalized and removed from the dialogues, from the advocacy, from the movement, from the theory. Intersectionality is not just about the study of identities and categories like, gay, straight, man, woman, citizen, non-citizen, stateless, migrant, Shia, Sunni. It's not studying them as static terms. Rather, it's to open up these categories and identities for analysis, for contextualization, to make these terms available for interpretation, for negation, for contestation, instead of presenting them as self-evident truths, as ends. As often viewed this way, they will result in ideological assumptions that end up oppressing certain groups of people in society, particularly those in the minority or in margins. So looked at this way, intersectionality, as Crenshaw and others tried to show, could be employed as a tool to emphasize on the political and structural inequalities, and a tool to engage with power, to investigate the overlapping and conflicting dynamics of racial, ethnic, gender, class, and other inequalities and discrimination as they operate within and in relation to power structures. We need to think of intersectionality as a nodal point rather than a closed system, as Crenshaw and others have shown. Now, if we think of intersectionality as it pertains to migrant domestic workers and to pinpoint where structural power and inequality resides, then we have to take a hard look at the hegemonic kafala system as a system of governance, power, and oppression. Kafala manifests in various forms along the migration chain from country of origin to country of destination, and it is diffused into the private sphere. It defines the roles and the dynamics of between the sponsor or the kafil and the worker, and it justifies violence. So I'm going to run very briefly, an overview of the migrants and then migrant domestic workers, and we can later delve into it in the discussion. So there are 700,000 domestic workers in Kuwait. That is a fifth of our population and a quarter of the labor market. And women make up almost 63%. What migrant domestic workers face under this system, and it's not limited to the list that I'm going to say, is that throughout the chain of migration from country of origin to destination countries, agencies and brokers deceive them into believing that there's a better world awaiting them on the other side. And as they travel along, they face physical, sexual, and verbal abuse. They are placed into very poor conditions and given limited food as a form of training. When they are assigned to an employer, they face high risks of not being paid their already low wages for months, and and confiscation of their passports, despite the most recent law just stipulating otherwise. They are vulnerable to all forms of violence and abuse when they are in the kafil's house. So it's physical, psychological, verbal abuse, as well as kidnapping and sex trafficking should they abscond. And if they abscond, they either become illegal freelancers and hide from the authorities because they risk deportation, or if they're lucky, they stay at the shelters, at their respective embassies, if their respective embassies provide shelters, or manage to find a new kafil and then go through the same cycle. Finally, they have limited networks and lack resources and access to communities and face language barriers if they seek justice. I will close with the words of Bell Hooks from her book, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. Hooks says, and I quote, "To be in the margins is to be part of the whole, but outside of the main body." And if we use the example of migrant live-in domestic workers, we see evidence of these borders within individual households. Domestic workers operate as part of the whole household, but are excluded when their service is complete. And so they retreat back into their margins in silence. And even if they are operating in the center, they are without a voice. They are invisible. Or as Dr. Munez just said, they are a ghost. And if we were to succeed in birthing an intersectional movement, then we need to ensure that migrant women tell their own stories, that we don't tokenize them on any international day, but ensure that they have a protected space to speak, and to organize and mobilize and demand for their rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheikha, for that, for your beautiful remarks. Thank you for highlighting and speaking to one of the questions that I asked about which women are invisible to the discourse of women's rights. Thank you for highlighting that we need to bring those who are silenced to the discussion, that we need to stop speaking on the behalf of domestic workers. We need to let them speak. And there is an urgent need to give them the protection to be able to speak. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they do not have the protection that is needed to be able to speak, on International Day, and how the term International Day itself is tokenized in the Gulf, where we just often talk about, we see similar faces every year talking about their success stories and not really going down to what needs to be done and how can we move forward. I now move to Hasna, who will be talking about Islamic feminism and in relation to intersectional feminism. Hasna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that, Zarqa. Thank you for the invitation. I'm so privileged and honored to be amongst these amazing feminists. So Bismillah. In March of 2010, I bid the city I grew up in farewell with an opinion piece published in Arab News entitled Goodbye, Saudi Arabia. In the piece, I discussed how my decision to marry a non-Saudi made me confront a different intersection of the systematic oppression against Saudi women who choose to break away from the status quo. Having grown up in Jeddah to Saudi parents, I was sheltered from many of the society's problems. It was not until I started working as a journalist between 2006 and 2010 that I witnessed the conditions migrant workers who conduct manual labor get subjected to. They come from Indonesia, Philippines, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, Egypt, and other countries in Asia and Africa to suffer labor exploitation due to the kafala or sponsorship system, which may be, quote, comparable to slavery, end quote. I also came to know about citizenship privilege when I married my non-Saudi husband and learned about the inhumane conditions the Bedouin or stateless people have to bear. Describing this culture eloquently, Hatun al-Fasi wrote, quote, a culture of misogyny based on a hardcore reading of Islam fused with a harsh capitalist economy has exploited women for decades, if not centuries, end quote. I share all of this to say that my feminist ethics to condemn oppression of women and minorities and all others was part of my value system long before I learned the academic terminologies and theories. Fast forward a few years later, and I found myself in the realm of academia as a graduate student in the United States. My initial introduction to Islamic feminism was in 2014 when I accidentally discovered Amina Wadood's book, Inside the Gender Jihad, Women's Reform in Islam. I was both inspired and surprised to realize that questions of Quranic hermeneutics and gender roles were contested and debated by these giant feminists, offering new pathways for seekers like me. Speaking of Amina Wadood's work, Islamic feminists Keisha Ali, Juliana Hammer, and Laurie Silver state, quote, hers were the contribution that did not fit into existing molds as it explored new frontiers of Quranic exegesis, advanced and nuanced gender-conscious approaches to the text, and provided a model for women scholar activists in and far beyond our field of study, end quote. Not only that, but Wadood's work allowed me to reflect on my personal experiences as a Saudi American Muslim woman confronting oppression and how that shaped my critical consciousness. I quote, women's articulation of experience, as in Wadood's work, act as a source for the scholarly analysis and encompass and nourish the struggle for gender justice, end quote. Muslim and Islamic feminists have given me permission to reconsider forgoing my religion, my Muslim identity, because of the pain and the scars that misogyny in the name of God has left me with. From there, I embarked on a journey to reclaim Islam from the so-called scholars, preachers, and authoritative mouthpieces. Islamic feminism allowed me to approach religious texts with an open mind and heart and ground my research and activism within a feminist discourse and practice that embraces an Islamic worldview and paradigm. When I say Islamic feminism, I mean, quote, new discourses or interpretation of Islam and gender grounded in ijtihad or independent intellectual investigation of the Quran and other religious texts, end quote. But I also want to emphasize that, quote, Islamic feminists who articulate an egalitarian mode of Islam should not be confused with Islamist women who promote political Islam and its patriarchal version of their religion, end quote, by Margaret Badran. To situate my discussion within the Gulf or Khaliji context, and especially in relation to gender-based violence, I want to highlight how discussions of the Arab Gulf remain top-down, state-centric, lacks gender perspectives, and are trapped within a shallow and simplistic analysis of why violence happens, often alluding to religion, honor, and tradition. While there might be some level of truth to that, it is important to pay more attention to, quote, the connections, entanglements, and multiple forms of power, configurations that impinge on people's lives, as Nadja Al-Ali explained in her remarkable piece, Feminist Dilemmas, How to Talk About Gender-Based Violence in Relation to the Middle East. For example, the historical roots of the colonial project in the Arab Gulf, the patriarchal authoritarian state and politicized Islam, the accepted culture of violent and hegemonic masculinities, the effect of oil and modernizations on moral and ethics and living, the cycle of familial and intergenerational trauma and violence, politics of privilege, foreign aid and intervention, the injustices committed against the Bidun, the domestic workers, the laborers, and the marginalization of and racism against Bedouins and homophobia against LGBTQI people contribute to perpetuating the most vile forms of gender-based violence in the region. This has ranged from domestic violence, intimate partner violence, verbal and physical abuse, sexual assault and rape, spiritual and legal abuse, economic violence, and murder. A thorough examination of the problem must take into account the nested levels of repression on structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized levels. We are in need of alternative models to analyzing and addressing social problems in the Gulf, away from the modes of carceral feminism that often ignores the ways in which race, class, gender, immigration, citizenship status, and more leave women vulnerable to more violence. Increased policing, persecution, and imprisonment as the primary solution to violence hasn't worked so far well. According to Oxfam, one of the 16 facts about gender-based violence is that more often than not, perpetuators of violence go unpunished, and that laws that promote gender equality are not even applied. The legal system worldwide continues to fail survivors and often exacerbate the trauma they experience from violence. We also need to push back against the, quote, exceptionalist discourses that are still common about the Arabian Peninsula, end quote. And lastly, we need to be open and inclusive of a feminist Islamic discourse that speaks to a large segment of Khaliji people's understanding and worldviews, ways of knowing, and ways of being. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us, Hasna, your experience and for contextualizing state feminism and talking about gender violence and abuse in the Gulf, which I was, I hope we have time to talk a little bit more about, and also giving us an overview about Islamic feminism. This is again one of the under-discussed topics in the Gulf, but there have been, I think, numerous scholars from the Gulf who've written about this. So thank you for that. Last but not the least, we have Sana, who is going to be talking also about abuse and gender-based violence facing women of expat communities and more. Sana, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Greetings from Dubai. Many thanks to Gulf International Forum for organizing this fantastic discussion with such esteemed feminist scholars. As someone who has no formal background in gender studies, my sole aim for the coming 5 minutes is just to make as much sense as possible. So you all have been forewarned. Right. So yeah, Dubai. Dubai really, the most forward-looking city in MENA, the economic powerhouse of the region, a melting pot, so to speak, of 200 or so nationalities. I feel is a perfect and ideal setting to study intersectional feminism. Within the migrant diaspora itself, there are such extreme disparities between the lived experience of expat women coming from different socio-economic and cultural background. And what is interesting is that there is not an element of patriarchy that is at play here. It has purely a class dimension to it. And which again is due to the socio-economic and cultural foundation that came to be formed as an unintended consequence, of the boom period that that was witnessed by the GCC states at large. So, as an example, the experience of a white European expat woman who joins her husband, who might not be a very high-flying CEO, a managerial consultant at the most, to that of a South Asian expat woman who joins her husband, who is a legit white-collar professional. But then, both their experiences are such, poles apart. I mean, it's fairly common to see the white expatriate living the ideal suburban lifestyle of a housewife, zipping around in her SUV, trying to know more about the local culture, trying to befriend local people. But on the other hand, as much as the South Asian newly wedded wife would want to act touristy, at least for the first 6 months, she can't afford that luxury, because in all probability, you will find her struggling on the the public transport, trying to reach for one interview appointment to the other, because it is very hard to imagine a South Asian household to survive on a single income. So, I mean, my own experience as a second generation immigrant whose family has had almost a 45-year history living in this country alone. I mean, too bad for me, really. Too bad for me that I decided to take a sabbatical, a career sabbatical 4 years ago. I quit my full-time job, and that's it. I have no business now to be lurking around here still. Either I find another employment, or I be self-employed, or be married to someone here. So every 2 years, I have to face this very demeaning prospect of my father writing a letter to the immigration authorities, saying, this overgrown, shameless kid of mine is still unmarried, neither married, neither divorced. She is still living with me. I have to sponsor her. I mean, for what? Why? I opened my eyes here, and it's not that I have never partaken in the economic functions of the city. I gave 10 years of my life working full-time for one of the largest MNCs in the Middle East. And still it's an unthinkable thing to decide on a career sabbatical at this point. I mean, if I was a male, I wouldn't be even around here. So either ways, I mean, considering the fact that if I had work, if I would have been paid for all those 10 years that I worked at the same pay scale that is applied to a European expat or even an Emirati citizen, I don't know where I would be. Perhaps I wouldn't still be living rent-free with my parents here. So, I mean, that's about it. I mean, that's just a sneak preview of a relatively privileged expat woman in the city. And considering the migrant women who come here all alone to eke out a living, or who are promised certain job offers by their compatriots back home, and then sort of get pushed into sex trafficking here or somewhere else. I mean, that's another elephant in the room, and let's just not go there. So yeah, that's pretty much how I view intersectional feminism as a second generation immigrant. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sana, for that very honest discussion. You have answered some of my questions that I posed earlier, talking about deconstruction of this expat as one monolithic category, and the privileges and different levels of discrimination that may exist within this category itself. Thank you for speaking to that. And you also have spoken about identity politics as a second generation immigrant. In fact, there isn't much literature on that. So you're pointing towards a need to maybe talk about that more.
Yes, I won't hold back. I won't hold back that I think my group second-generation immigrants, both male and female, are the most overlooked. There is a tendency to reduce our existence to remittances and statistics, all economic connotations. But but it's pretty much beyond that.
Thank you very much for that. I can see. So this brings us to the end of our panelists' discussion. Though I have questions for them. I have questions for all of you. I can see on the side. I can see the audience engaging in discussion and comments. If you have any questions, please post. Because as of now, I see discussions happening between you, all of you. So if you'd like to pose a question to our panelists, I'm going to start by asking them a general question, which I hope that each one of the panelists would answer. And this is building on the discussions we've had now. So talking about intersectionality in the Gulf region, in the words of Sheikha, how can we if we are to birth this intersectional movement in the Gulf, how can women then unite? Or how can we talk about this, some sort of solidarity despite the privileges and differences that exist? In the Gulf. And so what is the future of intersectional feminism in the Gulf? And how should we move forward with it? I start with Dr. Haneen. Or anyone else who wants to go, no particular order, but Dr. Haneen, please.
Come to you. Okay, but can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So I'll very briefly. It starts with being aware of our privileges. That's for sure. A lot of this is the individual level. So first, I'm going to speak about the individual level. So if we're aware of our privileges, whether it's you're Kuwaiti or you're a man or you're educated or whatever it is, or you're upper class, if you're not aware of your privilege, and you can't just you don't wake up and you're aware of your privileges. It needs training. It needs a lot of disrupting your privilege exercise. There are actual exercises to disrupt your privilege. And if you don't go through those exercises and engage in this intersectional reflexivity, that's never going to happen. So that's on the individual level where we can see microaggressions, but also macroaggressions. But it's also about putting your body on the line. So if I'm going to go to a let's say I go into a Kuwaiti, speaking about, because this actually happened, speaking about the Bedouin issue. I have to put my body on the line in front of those Kuwaitis. I can't expect that Bedouin to put his body on the line and go through something like not renewing his or her ID card and a bunch of other systematic violent things that can happen. But I also expect men and other privileged identities to put their body on the line for me. Maybe I expect Kuwaiti women that are more privileged than me, let's say in terms of family, as an example, to put their body on the line. I need to put my body on the line for underprivileged students from those marginalized identities. And so it's privilege, being aware of your privileges, knowing when you're oppressing. We all do it by accident and by mistake, and we have to reflect on that. All of us have privileges. But also, how are you putting your body on the line? But then when you look at it at the macro level, how is capitalism and neoliberalism, even privatization, manifested this when it comes to the domestic workers especially, and when it comes to the Bedouin issue, is we've manifested it through capitalism. If we go in the direction that Kuwait wants to go to, which is privatization, it's going to get worse because we're going to use marginalized identities as cheap labor. It's just what we're already doing. And so it's a bunch of things coming into play at the same time.
Thank you, Dr. Haneen. Who wants to? I have a few questions lining up, so I want to make sure that I pose all these questions to the panelists. But can you all answer the question that I've asked? Whoever wants to go next, Dr. Mona.
Shukran Zarqa. I wanted to. Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing is the importance of the collective. So for example, like in the case of Bedouin women, there were Bedouin women who were writing, let's say, literature or writing some kind of writing, but they were individuals. That as individuals they couldn't do much. They couldn't realize much. They couldn't even, theorize around this, what is it to be Bedouin and woman. And I was one of these women. I did write about these experiences. They did resonate with some people, but it still, remains some kind of, one-on-one interaction. It's only when there was a Bedouin movement, a mass movement that was born in 2011, that through that movement and the involvement of Bedouin women in that movement, that now we get to think about, like, what is it to be a Bedouin woman? What is this intersection between, like, how does citizenship make my life as a woman, the lack of citizenship, even more difficult and becoming more vulnerable? How does class count into this, right? So I want to just stress this, because I feel like we have always been pushed, as whether individuals or groups, we have been pushed away from the collectives, away from everyday politics, away from mass movements, as if we cannot exist within these movements, right? Like, as if we cannot, like, imagine ourselves part of these movements, right? So that makes us that, some isolated, suspicious group, right? Like, as if we are not, and of course I mentioned state feminism, and I really feel like state feminism still dominates in the Gulf, but sometimes it's not necessarily even state, just sometimes even neutrality plays, this role of, like, making feminism feel like irrelevant, or that it's not engaged, so I feel like this is as crucial, that when we think about feminism intellectually, or we think about it as conversation, we need to find ways where this exists within the larger scale of politics, right? Like, and by that I don't mean just suffrage and like parliament and all that. I really feel like there's many ways where this could happen. Politics take place on different levels.
Thank you. Very insightful. Sheikha, you're next.
Sure. Thank you for this really important question. I think if we like, I will use example of migrant domestic workers, considering that this is the work I've been doing for the past 4 months. We need to move beyond the empty slogans, right? We need to move beyond just posting on social media that we care about migrant workers, that we want to abolish kafala, without actually having to go on the ground in the field and to meet them, to meet the migrants, to meet the domestic workers. We will never be able to understand, because then we will be looking at it from our own privilege, from what we think is going to be good for them, not what they think is good, for them. And that's one step of, beginning this whole birthing of intersectionality. Because if we do it from our privilege, then we are going to risk something, like we're going to risk reforming the margins, but not the actual framework. And that is really, really important, because when I decided to move out of my bubble and I decided to sit in front of the domestic workers, and the first thing I told them, and I got attacked for saying this publicly once, is that just don't look at me as a Kuwaiti woman. Look at me as a woman and a human just like you. I really wanted her, or the workers, to relax, because she will always see me as, she was kept on calling me madam. I'm like, no, just call me Sheikha, so we can talk together, so I can understand what you're suffering. And if we look at all the NGOs and the civil societies that are advocating for women, when we bring in domestic workers, if we want their buy-in, they need to start at home. They can't go out and advocate for ending violence against women and then practice, the whole the internalized masculinity within them on domestic workers. So I think it starts, from out to in and then in to out. So that's like the way I see it.
Thank you, Sheikha. Hasna, you're next.
Well, I think everybody has said a lot, and I agree with most of what has been said, but I think we need more discussions like these. God knows how much we need that, especially within the English context of Khaliji feminism. That's lacking. with different perspectives. I think also we need to be comfortable to sit with a lot of discomfort when it comes to these discussions, because no matter, it's one thing to do feminism as an academic exercise and a public performance, and it's another thing to do it on a daily basis as holding ourselves accountable to what we do when no one is looking, to the little things that we do behind closed doors, even to help one person, and sitting with that discomfort of our own shortcomings and our own blind spots. And the way I see me continuing this work as a survivor and as an anti-violence advocate within that context is that I need to continue on myself, focusing on my healing and my inner self and my inner work, but at the same time engaging with the community. And one cannot go without the other. So more conversations of that, please, and let's sit with our discomfort.
Thank you very much. Asana, you're next.
Can I just choose to answer Arij's question in the comment section directly?
That question, I have a list of questions, and that is coming next.
Okay.
So, but I also want to answer this question, and then we move to the next.
I seem to have lost track of the question again. Sorry, could you repeat it?
What do you think? That's okay. What do you think is the future of intersectional feminism in the Gulf, and how can we move forward to having, let's say, an organized maybe ideology or structure?
Okay, right. I mean, if I were to personalize this question, I think I might have touched upon the disparate experiences between different. I don't want to necessarily call them migrant groups because I don't consider myself a migrant, but between different expat women. But I think it's not fair the permanently temporary status of all of us here adversely impacts each one of us in different ways. So it's really not fair to just overly focus on how the lived experiences, and which, I mean, amongst the migrant groups, which are the most privileged ones, no doubt that is a matter of the fact. But then I think there should be more discussions. And I mean, again, it's. I don't think so. It can be reduced to feminism alone. What is encountered by third culture kids like me, or second generation immigrants, even the expat women who have lived here for decades and whose kids have been born here. So I think again, such more and more such forums where we discuss how the kind of limbo status affects everyone from every part of the world adversely. More discussion on that.
Thank you very much. I now move to questions from the audience. We have a couple of questions, but due to time limits, I'm going to ask maybe 2 or 3.
Can I just add something quickly? It's a point that Dr. Shahad Al-Shamari made in the comment, and I think it's a very important one about disabled women who need the joint conversation too. And I think she's a leading expert in that field, and she should have probably been with us today in that discussion.
Yeah. I agree, Dr. Shahad. It would be lovely to have her on stage. I admire her work. She's very brave, has done brilliant, innovative work on disability in the Gulf. A big fan of her work. So acknowledging her for sure. We have a question from Arij Al-Shamari, who this question is, she says it's specific to Sana, but anyone can answer this. So I'm going to direct this question to Sana. How can you describe your relationship to other migrant groups? Are you able to hear me? I thought I was.
Yes.
Okay. So right. Let me just. How do you describe your relationship to other migrant groups? Do you experience the hierarchy that is enforced by the state among migrant populations?
Right. My relationship, again, with my supposed compatriots, I mean, officially with Indian migrant groups, I mean, I feel I'm able to connect more. I don't know whether this answers her question really, but then I'm able to connect more with third culture kids or second generation immigrants who were born here, and there's a lot less to connect to perhaps new arrivals from India or other South Asian countries. And in terms of state enforcing hierarchies, of course, I mean, state does has a role to play in this. I mean, you just have to enter any government office. Thankfully, there has been a greater shift to e-governance in the past decade and a half. But then you just have to enter any government office, and then you could see the differences in behavior of officials as per the color of the skin and the whole. Definitely there is. It just starts from the state as well. Even the whole concept of paying employees not as per the JD but as per their sending home country. So I think it's pretty much a foundation that has been laid by the state and enforced by the state as well.
Thank you very much.
Can I add something? Because as you know, there's the Filipino Domestic Workers Organization in Kuwait, Sandigan, and it started off mainly for Filipinos, helping each other out, and they've created this amazing organization led by the most inspiring woman I've ever met, Ana Bunda. And recently they've included Ethiopian domestic workers because they don't have any diasporic organizations representing them. And slowly they have a place now, so they've invited the Ethiopian domestic workers, but there's also this language barrier between them. And what they did is they tried to find a translator. And what they do all together, and it's so inspiring. They work on training them how to sew dresses or masks, something, all these activities that they do. It's a bonding, activity. At the same time, they're trying to raise funds on their own, and they've created other coalitions with the Indian, community especially from Kerala. And other organizations, and it's really important to learn from how they've mobilized and organized themselves. I think that will also help us help them.
Thank you, Sheikha. I now have another question. This question is posed as a general question to all the panelists. Is there a problem with feminism becoming a primarily academic discourse where language takes precedence over experience? Who is able to frame it best? Excludes those who may not have the language. A very interesting question. Very, very interesting question. Who wants to go first? Maybe the academics, I'm not sure, but anyone.
It's up to you all. Does anybody want?
I'll just say something quickly. Language is access, and the language we speak and we choose to write with makes a huge difference for sure. And this is one of my struggles with some of the writings that I read, is that it speaks to the ivory tower rather than to the people. And so one of my missions is to continue to center my experience and try to avoid language that is often too complicated. That's number one. Number two, translating the work that we do. And I think there's Dr. Muna and Dr. Haneen is leading in this and doing work in multiple languages. Number three, and I think I mentioned this earlier, how do we engage? I mean, one of the biggest issues with the academia separation of practice is that there is this gap that people think that just because you write and you theorize means that you don't engage with the public. And I think this is a false dichotomy that needs to be shattered. We do this work because we care and because we want to change things on the ground, and we have to be to continue to the work, even on small scales. As I said, I'm not the person who would go out and protest in streets and carry signs, but I try to do the work one-on-one with women behind the scenes as much as I could. So in our different capacities, what is it that we're learning? How can we translate into experience, and how can we do it in everyday life activism?
Yeah, and just to, I think what Hasnat said was so important. And to add on that, and I'm also reading the comments, which are brilliant, by the way. Everything, I agree with almost everything I'm reading, but yeah, centering our experiences, and I think that's why one of the methodologies that I work with, autoethnography, is so close to my heart, is because it centers that experience where you're writing from the heart, where are you writing from experience and not. And yes, you're coupling it with academic theory and academic discourse, but you're actually writing your lived experience. You're writing your body literally onto the paper. And so I think autoethnography is a very important methodology. I tend to I know, because I was also reading Dr. Shahad al-Shimmari's comment, and I think she's pioneer, leading in Kuwait in intersectional feminism and disability studies. And we wrote an article together, and it was such a beautiful experience because we were writing our bodies onto the paper. And I think that's important. I think for my own self, I have been recently moving in the directions of on the ground movement work, and I don't like to and I don't want to get into detail, but I've already been going in that direction as well.
I think if I want to answer this question, I mean, just adding to what everyone said, and stressing the same point about like how we should like be part of mass movements and everything, but I also feel like sometimes I think there is an under appreciation of what happens in academia. I feel like we overestimate the isolation. I really think like just speaking with academics who are in the region, I feel like sometimes academia can introduce important ideas, and we can't really predict how ideas move, and sometimes it's the classroom that introduces such ideas. And I think someone in the questions asked about cyberfeminism, and I think that's such a big thing in the Gulf, especially in maybe the Saudi example, and something that people really underestimated and wanted to talk about as something marginal, but in the past 10 years it's proved to be like an actual platform that substitutes for the lack of a public shared space where such thinking can happen and such organizing can happen. So I really feel like the way ideas move is hard to predict, and I feel like of course we really need to write more in Arabic and think in Arabic, and translate theory not only from Western feminism, just as important third world feminism, and into Arabic, but also think about English as an opportunity, right? Because we are like this region is so multilingual, and sadly we are yet to even like acknowledge all these languages that exist in the Gulf. And I feel like maybe English helps us to as a mediating language, to have such conversations or think together or organize together as well.
Does anyone want to say something before I ask one final question? No? All right. I wanted to add something to on academia.
There was a discussion on sectarianism in the chat, and I just want to tell people to read Omar Shihabi's book about contested modernity to just kind of get some idea on that topic.
Yeah, that's an excellent book by Omar. Yeah, I definitely recommend you to read that. But I also think it's very interesting when we talk about gender sectarianism with the gendered lens. I think we need to maybe also have more discussions on that. And this is why I was saying that it's so important to contextualize intersectional feminism in the Gulf, because sectarian identities are so under-discussed, yet they are such big parts of people's lived realities, structurally, systematically. I wanted to say something about academia. As an academic myself, and I often question this, and I say this to myself, how can I make academia more accessible? In Gulf, I think sometimes academia gives you a safe space to be able to talk about topics that you otherwise wouldn't be able to talk about in public. And I also think that for us to kind of move forward, I would say in an organized way, or to have some sort of framework of discussion, I think it's important to have some sort of academic research. I think it can inform meaningful policy reforms. But having said that, I do understand what you mean, how academia can exclude people, and which is why I personally took it upon me to write out more opinion pieces where I was making it more, it was opinion piece, but informed by academic concepts to make it more accessible. And I think we need to do more of that in the Gulf. We have a very interesting question from Isra, who is a colleague as well. brilliant academic who's asking us about the human rights report in Qatar and how that has created a backlash. I don't know if you guys were able to read the report on Human Rights Watch. They just published it today. About women's rights situation in Qatar, and I know they included some girls who had fled, and I know they did some speak to some other women as well. But it created a huge backlash about how these international institutions are claiming to speak on the behalf of women, I know they were in a conversation with me as well last year, and I had said this to them openly, that I don't think it's fair for you to, from the outside, be speaking on the behalf of women. Even if you talk to them, you are still selecting which woman you want to talk to. So what do you think about that? If not about the human rights support in Qatar, what do you think about these international agencies talking on the behalf of women?
I think Leila Abulukad has a really really excellent article. I think she just, I don't remember the report's name. I think it was the 2005 gender report by the UN or something. I can't really remember the name right now. But she really raised a lot of important points and how these reports are very selective, and some of them are kind of tone deaf to what's really happening in place. And at the same time, they sort of demonize Islamic feminism to some extent, and try to show that any kind of domestic violence is like, it's related to like the structure in the Gulf, and again it goes back to the veiling and a lot of these like, you know, symbolic things that are associated with the Gulf without really understanding what's really happening in place. And again, the report, although included really important, you know, academics from the region, it wasn't really cohesive altogether in capturing what really needs to take place or really understanding what's happening. And I think, I mean, I haven't read the Human Rights Watch one, but I did like it, so I can you know, read it later. But I think it falls into that same trap.
I would add, and I would love to read the report. I did not read it. I'm very interested in reading it, so I can't give my opinion on the report, but I can give you my general opinion. And I talk about it briefly in my book. Is we have to look at Talal As'ad's work. Why? Because Talal As'ad actually critiques the whole human rights classification. He says it was derived out of this Anglo-American tradition, and it's become, you know, part of what we call today human rights. So, and I actually, in my global communication class, where we bring in necropolitics and biopolitics with communication, we actually go through the human rights discourse, and we critique each act or each article, whatever you want to call them. But the states, so, and he says it's exact same way, where states will use human rights against their citizens in the same manner that colonial empires use it against their subjects. And so there's this whole like problematization of, are we reinventing or reasserting? I've been speaking in Arabic so long that English isn't even coming to me. We're reasserting this colonization, right? And so there's this hegemonic thought. And I think reading his article was mind-blowing for me. It changed my whole outlook on all of the human rights organizations, UN, all of them, etc. No?
We're having a follow-up interesting comments from Vanya and Isra herself, saying, but you know, there are no other alternative reports. So, for example, a lot of the women feel like they don't have alternate venues to speak. So I agree with you. My personal approach is that this is reinstating this idea of this, you know, speaking on the behalf of the other, or the Orient, you know, orientizing the Gulf woman. But then why, you know, who else is writing alternate reports? Who else is, you know, very interesting comment. Who wants to speak to that?
I think there's a problem when we start to simplify social change in terms of reports. I think there's a big problem there, and indicators, and what a lot of the transnational feminists has coined as the human rights regime. that end up perpetuating a lot of the patriarchal and new colonial structures, unfortunately. What I would like to just contribute to this discussion, so who gets to decide what social change looks like? Is it the UN? And what kind of culture are they bringing in with them? Like we often look at the UN as this holy, kind of unproblematic structure, but then UN has its own culture of who gets to speak and what kind of, hierarchy within that structure as well. So I just want to add from Sally Engel-Marie, who just passed, an amazing anthropologist who wrote a lot about gender-based violence and critiqued especially CEDAW and the UN, this very specific quote that I want to share. She says, "Those who create indicators aspire to measure the world, but in practice create the world they are measuring. In other words, indicators do not stand outside regimes of power and governance, but exist within them, both in their creation and in their ongoing functioning." So why is it that we need to report, like this whole thing is just very problematic, and we need to kind of be very nuanced and how to, yes, we need to know what the reality of situation is and how we need numbers and we need studies to kind of measure the problem. But at the same time, like, is it just a matter of producing reports and kind of putting out knowledge that, that continues to the same cycle? Or can we imagine alternative ideas and alternative ways of addressing the issues?
Thank you very much, Hasna. This is a brilliant contribution, and I know you also talk about decolonizing knowledge production. So I think your contribution is very, very important, and I definitely agree with you. Here we're dealing with the politics of knowledge production that a lot of Arab, Middle Eastern feminist scholars have written about. I know Dr. Islah Jad wrote about this as well, and so many other names. We are now coming to the end of our panel. I want to ask, before my closing remarks, I want to ask each panel speakers to tell us if they'd like to add something. Would you want to say something or add something that you think we did not discuss in today's discussion? Starting with Dr. Haneen.
There's so much that we didn't discuss for the sake of time. I think there should be a whole session on women, disability, also tribal women. There's so much. I can't remember who was speaking about speaking for or speaking with, and I remembered Linda Alcoff's article, which I think is really, really important. How do we know if we're speaking with and speaking for? But there was also something that Dr. Muna said that reminded me of how do we create that space. That activism is in the classroom is an act of activism also. Like, how do you create that space with your marginalized identities, guiding your privileged students also into these intersections of activism in the classroom, which will also translate into activism. But Dr. Muna sparked that the whole classroom as a space for that, and outside the classroom, how do we translate all these rights? But also what Dr. Hasnat was saying is this decolonial or post-colonial lens, because if we don't colonize our knowledge, we're not going to get anywhere. And it goes with what you were also saying, Zarqa, which is translating and so forth. So we're another community that is completely under the radar is also the LGBTQ community. But then you're in this space where there's so many intersecting identities, and the state and the state and control and capitalism muffles these voices and muffles us also at times, right? Depending on which identity you're in, is it you're a woman, or are you Kuwaiti, or are you Kuwaiti Palestinian, or are you from the LGBTQ community? What is going on at that same time? Because it's not a standalone identity. It's not static. Like Sheikha was saying, they intersect, and location matters, right? My identity in Kuwait is completely different when I go to the US, completely different. And so also our identity is never static. It's always in flux. And I think I'll end there, but this panel was brilliant. I couldn't stop listening to all of you, and I'm so happy to be here with you.
Thank you, Dr. Haneen. It was a pleasure having you. Next, we have Dr. Muna.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like, just looking at the comments, people were raising different concerns, like way beyond like what the scope of this panel is. So it feels to me like maybe we just need an entire conference, not not a panel. And we also should acknowledge the fact that even though there were, of course, generations before us that tried to study gender studies, really it's only this generation that in the scope of things, but also just in the number of people who are focusing on gender studies in the Gulf example. I feel like, so we just really feel overwhelmed. We feel overwhelmed with like how much we need to address, and where do we start and where do we go, right? Like all of this. And I guess like one last thing I wanted to say is that I feel like there's always a really good opportunity to like an opportunity that we are missing on, which is like having opening these dialogues and conversations with feminist or groups and organizations in both South Asia and in Africa. And I feel like these might be even more crucial, especially because again, I think of the Gulf as a transnational space, and you can't do this from top to bottom. You got to do this, in collaboration with others. And some of you mentioned, like for example, the Filipino women workers in the Gulf who have their own, groups that just started first as, like as out of emergency, out of like that. But I really feel like there is a missed opportunity here, because who says this is not a feminist group to think with? Who says that there isn't potential that could come out from this? So I hope that more conversations will open. I hope we do translate like our transnational understanding of this region in the way we create these intellectual exchanges.
Thank you, Dr. Muna. And Sheikha?
Thank you so much. I think, starting this conversation, having this panel should be the beginning of having more panels, and maybe including, speakers from the marginalized communities, from sectarian groups, from, just to hear everyone, and not just, limited to academics, and anyone who is willing to speak about their experience. It will be really added value. I think one of the things that, because it's, we're short on time, that we didn't get to touch on, is the problem of our laws, and how our laws are, asserting our roles, are subjugating us, especially when, for example, I know that in Kuwait we still have a separate, personal status law for Shia, and a person, another one for the Sunni. And then if we go back and look, historically, why, how these, personal law status came to be about. I would really want to recommend a really important book called Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, 1830 to 1930, by Judith Circus. And she really tracks like how, all these laws, including, child marriage and the age, limit for child marriage, and, the inability to pass citizenship, like from the mother's side. And I think this is an important topic where all of us are still talking about it right now in the Gulf, or women who are not married to non-citizens cannot pass, this is citizenship to their, children. And that's, that's a form of a marginalized community. So I think, bringing these things to the table is really important. And this was really great. And the comments are really heartwarming. I feel like they're with us in the panel as well. So thank you for everyone who joined tonight.
Thank you. Oh, I'm very happy to see that Dr. Hatoun is also joining us. I'm so happy that you're with us today. Hasna?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm just beyond, really beyond grateful and very humble to be among this amazing group of people, of feminists. And there's so much, as everybody said, that needs to be covered. And this is just the spark of a beginning of a much needed conversation in the region, and have more voices included. So thank you. I appreciate everyone, and I look forward to more conversations like that.
Sana?
Yes, I mean, nothing to add really, and really grateful to Gulf International Forum for inviting me, and it's been an absolute amazing discussion. Look forward to receiving the reading list somehow. I couldn't note down the name of all the authors, so yes, definitely. The conversation has just begun. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our audience. And sorry if I wasn't able to cover all of your questions. We actually went over time. I just want to end by saying that this is just the beginning. We are just scratching the surface. Today's discussion was very, very enriching. Literally, I'm going to listen to the recording again because there were so many great ideas that were discussed. And I think this could be the foundation of moving forward with intersectional feminism. I think we're just now starting to understand how can we problematize structures, how can we problematize systems, and how can we move forward with creating something that's more inclusive, how can we work with what's already existing on the ground, and I'm sure there's a lot of work that has been done, so maybe it's time to combine forces now. And how can we move beyond state feminism? I don't even want to call this state feminism. This is proto-state feminism, because sometimes these reforms don't really work in the favor of women, really, and it makes enemies out of women. My biggest takeaway is that we need to bring the invisible woman to the table if we really want this to be an inclusive movement. Thank you so much. Thank you to Dr. Dania, to Anas, who organized the logistics so beautifully. Thank you to all the speakers, and I look forward to hearing from you, maybe in a different space. And I don't know how to end this, but I'm going to